Thank you for joining us online today, especially to our speakers and viewers who are coming from outside of Toronto, which is where I am today. My name is Kristyn Wong-Tam, and I'm the Member of Provincial Parliament and the official opposition critic for the Ministry of the Attorney General. On September morning in 2015, Ontario lost 3 women to preventable gender-based violence when they were murdered in Renfrew County. Anastasia Cusick, Natalie Warmerdam, as well as Carol Cullerton were victims of intimate partner violence, all killed by the same man. The perpetrator had a history of abusive behavior towards these women and demonstrated a pattern of violent conduct spanning the last 40 years, making his crime preventable as well as predictable. It's a tragedy that authorities should have seen coming and did not. In June of 2022, after a lengthy and emotional process and hearing from witnesses ranging from academic experts to law enforcement, a jury into the historic Renfrew Inquest issued 86 recommendations to save lives by preventing the systemic causes behind gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. These recommendations were directed to a number of public bodies, including the federal government, the Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, and the province's chief firearms officer. The vast number of these recommendations, 68 out of the 86 recommendations, or nearly a total of 80% of those recommendations, fall under provincial purview. Therefore, they are to be enacted on by this provincial government. The coroner's office asked those named in the inquest to provide responses and indicate if there was any progress. That deadline for the provincial government was last Friday. The Ford government has now issued a 55-page response that was released on Monday. Overall, the response was vague and lacking. It's now been 7 years and 5 months since the Renfrew triple femicide, and the clock to making substantial action is still ticking, and the days are slipping by as the Ford government fails to step up to do their part to prevent deaths in Ontario. We will now be hearing from the following speakers in this order. Erin Lee. Erin has spent decades working to end violence against women. Erin is the executive director of the Lanark County Interval House and the Community Support, co-founder of Lyanne Hayes Memorial Fund, coordinating committee member, and member of Victimology Advisory of Algonquin College. Erin was a member of the EVA Inquest, the working group, and offered testimony related to rural realities as a neighboring rural county. Malcolm Warmerdam. His mother was one of 3 women killed. Last year, he was granted standing and took an active role in the inquest to looking into those deaths. It included testifying and helping shape the recommendations through questioning that was brought forward and to share their expertise. Jill Andrew, who is the MPP for Toronto St. Paul's and the official opposition critic for women's social and economic opportunity. But first up, it's my honor to introduce Marit Stiles, someone who actually needs no introduction. You all know her. She is the new leader of the Ontario NDP and of the official opposition.
Thank you so much, Kristyn, and thank you, Jill, Erin, Malcolm, for being here today. Thank you again, Kristyn, for your extraordinary leadership as our critic on the Attorney General, and to Jill for her extraordinary work. And thank you to the many community organizations and activists in Renfrew and across the province for the work you do. They've been doing the work needed to help eradicate intimate partner violence for so many years. And the fact is that people shouldn't have to push their government so hard for action on such an insidious issue. The inquest's report laid out specific, concrete actions and solutions under provincial jurisdiction that would help eliminate intimate partner violence. They laid out a roadmap to action. But so far, Doug Ford's Conservative government has not delivered. And that's why we're here today. Indeed, the Ford government's latest report on this doesn't even acknowledge half of the inquest's recommendations, such as declaring intimate partner violence an epidemic. They're dragging their feet, and we cannot allow it. This is a public health crisis. Those affected by intimate partner violence have been waiting far, far too long. And I want to say, I hear from people every single day who say to me they want and deserve a government that is actually listening, one that cares, and one that takes positive action. We're going to honor the women whose lives were cut short and others affected by intimate partner violence. And we're going to continue to press this government for action on practical ways to help address this growing issue in our communities. And now I want to turn over the microphone to Erin Lee, the Executive Director of Lanark County Interval House, to share with us the perspective of the community in terms of their needs and also in terms of their hopes for a path to action. Over to you, Erin.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It is my honor to be here to amplify the voices of people in rural communities. I live in a rural community. I work in a rural community of approximately 75,000. I think it's important for Ontarians to know that Ontario is vastly more rural than it is urban. I think it's important to recognize that for rural communities, as recently as last Friday, my community was under an alert that indicated that there was a manhunt, schools were locked down, and people were asked to stay in place, lock their cars, and lock their doors. Those are lived realities in a rural community that is vastly geographically wide and large, and it is important for us to be taking action together. And that is what rural communities are doing. Rural communities have embraced the 86 recommendations across the province. They also see it, as our leader mentioned, as a roadmap with a rural focus. Actions are happening, gatherings are happening, amplifying voices of rural communities, campaigns are being initiated, action plans are starting, and media uptake has been extraordinary in terms of ensuring that these recommendations remain front and center and everyday news. When we talk about femicide and we talk about the fact that since November, 14 femicides have occurred, and of those 14 femicides, 28% of them have been rural. It is small rural communities that are taking the most critical recommendations and moving them into action. Small rural community like Lanark County passed recommendation number 1 of the jury's recommendations on December the 14th, 2023. Recommendation number 1, as you all know, is to declare IPV an epidemic. As a result of a small community embracing and understanding and validating the voices of their constituents, the voices of people living with and waiting for government response, they passed that resolution. As a result of that, 444 municipalities have also received that resolution, and there is lots of action and conversations happening across municipalities. It's only in a rural community that on a Friday evening you could offer a forum for people to talk about the recommendations and to hear voices and to ask questions and be engaged as part of the solution. And you get 150 local community members in a small community coming out to fill a room and talk about how they want to be part of that solution. It is the rural voices and rural communities that are leading this and are setting the example for others. I was fortunate as a member of a rural community to have my rural community secure a delegation at Roma this past January. And on January 23rd, I presented a brief and spoke to 2 ministers related to the critical recommendations around the declaration, around implementation plan and committee overseeing bodies and perpetrator intervention. We're on the road. We are on the road as rural communities, and I implore the government to meet us where we're at and work alongside us and take the necessary action to stop intimate partner violence in the province of Ontario and to respond to communities that are in the process of healing from the trauma of ongoing violence. I would like to take at this time the opportunity to pass it over to Malcolm Warmerdam.
Thank you very much, Erin. Thank you all for being here. I want to start by reiterating the importance of recommendation 5, which is the implementation of instituting a provincial implementation committee for these recommendations. If we can get that one in place, the hope is that that will get the ball moving on the rest of these very important recommendations. When these recommendations were put forward, it was asked that that one be done immediately. And it is one of the ones that has not yet been addressed by Government of Ontario. I want to see a commitment on that happening yesterday, and I want that committee to be meeting and taking actions before the 1-year anniversary of these recommendations coming out. I am very disappointed that that hasn't made the first round of responses. During the inquest, we heard testimony on a number of the problems that the system has right now in trying to deal with intimate partner violence. And we heard numerous experts speak on evidence-based solutions and practices that are helping solve these problems on the ground and at small scale in various places. And we heard a lot of different options. From this, the jury has put together these recommendations. A lot of those recommendations had to do with how to prevent recidivism and to reintegrate perpetrators into their communities, because we don't just put people in jail for the rest of their lives. That's not something we do now outside of very extreme situations. So if we're not doing that, we need to find a way to prevent people from committing violence again and prevent violence from escalating. We've put together, there's 8 recommendations specifically towards this. Recommendations 32 through 39 are in regards to handling perpetrators and trying to reintegrate them. None of those 8 recommendations were ones that were responded to by Government of Ontario yet, and I am very disappointed by that. These are complex recommendations to try to implement. I'm not expecting them to have gotten everything done and completed by now, but I was expecting a commitment to this very important part of the puzzle. And I just haven't seen that yet, and I'm disappointed. And I'm going to take that opportunity to pass you on to Jill Andrews.
Thank you, Malcolm. It means so much that you are here with us today. Here in Ontario, since 1990, over 980 women have been killed through femicide. One is too many. The Ford government, the Ford Conservative government, has dropped the ball with their lackluster responses to the Renfrew County recommendations. Too little, too late, not enough. Ignoring survivors and their communities re-traumatizes, and it sends the message to perpetrators that women's lives, their safety, and their security does not matter. Renfrew County community and allies across this province have spoken, and it is the Ford Conservative government's responsibility to listen and commit to creating the laws necessary to confront violence against women in Ontario head on. That is how we support survivors. It is how we shore up the necessary resources to support understaffed and underpaid workers on the front lines supporting survivors. It is how we amplify the advocacy efforts of community that has led this work with courage. Make no mistake, the Ford Conservative government holds the purse strings, everyone, and they have the power to implement these recommendations, as Malcolm said yesterday. The Ontario government has 68 opportunities to act on gender-based violence in honor of victim survivors, their children, and those we have lost to femicide. And as some of our speakers have highlighted today, there are many recommendations. And community has been patient. but this has been years. Through consultation that I've had the honor of doing with folks, I know that there are 4 recommendations that the government could act on today. For starters, the Conservative government must formally declare intimate partner violence an epidemic and create the role of a survivor advocate on behalf of survivors regarding their experience in the justice system. Doug Ford dismantled the Ontario Violence Against Women Roundtable the moment he took office in 2018. And that began his callous cuts to rape crisis, sexual assault centers, and community-based supports for survivors. Today, the Doug Ford Conservative government has an opportunity to immediately institute a provincial implementation committee chaired by an independent intimate partner violence expert to ensure these recommendations are understood and implemented accordingly. Why? Because government accountability is key. And thank you, Malcolm, for highlighting it. We've waited too many years. The government has had months since this report dropped in June of 2022 to get off of their butts and act. Recommendation 7 will ensure that intimate partner violence issues are addressed using an all-government interministerial approach across levels of government. Why? Because it's every single member's responsibility in the legislature to stand up for and with survivors and those who we have lost. Gender-based violence and intimate partner violence have increased during the pandemic, and thoughts and prayers are simply not enough. Pay inequities continue to create the social conditions where too many women must live with their abusers, unable to afford financially to leave. Women dying at the hands of male violence, and a government that ignores its culpability is not okay. I assure you, as the Ontario NDP official opposition critic for women's social and economic opportunities, joined by our fierce leader, Marit Stiles, our Attorney General critic, MPP Kristyn Wong-Tam, community leaders like Erin Lee, like Malcolm, like those who are not on the screen. We will continue to fight for victim survivors, for those we have lost in all communities across Ontario, urban, rural, northern communities, to end femicide and intimate partner violence. This is, as our leader Marit Stiles eloquently said, a public health issue. Carol, Anastasia, and Natalie should still be here with us, with their community, with their families. They should still be here. The Ford government needs to act now. Tomorrow is too late.